Sammy, pull up here somewhere. Here are the notes that we're using today. Everybody have access to the, we're not gonna, you do not have to read from these. Just hang on to the, there for me. And then later you can get to your room or somewhere when your cataracts clear up or whatever. Ellen, you want one of these?
Thank you.
What I like to try to do, what we started in June and what we'll be doing the Thursdays of August is making an effort to get down inside the Bible. This is what I'm calling ourselves here. There's sort of two levels to do this kind of thing. There is what typically we would call Bible study, which in my view tends to be a rather devotional approach, which is kind of what we typically think of as Bible study. And so for the last several years, I'm not trying to do that, though we will do some of that. But my sense is I don't want to say my calling, but my emphasis is to try to understand the Bible as the Bible. It is by any stretch the most important book in the English language and in many, many other languages. And it has been for an incredibly long time. People say that it is probably the most important book to come out in the last 2,000 years. And it has certainly shaped much of the world, particularly the Western world. North, South America, Europe, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, many, many parts. Of course, there are other great world religions also. 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, Islam emerged. Judaism in its many, many, many iterations is incredibly old. So the Bible is our book. It is our book of the West, what I call the West. And because of that, I think it's helpful, it is to me, and I hope to you too, to get down inside of the Bible. What is the Bible? Where did it come from? And how, what is it? I think a better way to understand, but certainly another way to understand this great book that is ours for 2,000 years, really, in many ways, 2,500. So that's what we're trying to do. Now, the one that I have opted for today is the very, very famous story of David and Bathsheba. I've printed it here and I've broken it up into paragraphs. So if you've got your glasses on, anybody we can start reading here. If you want to read, I don't want to have to do all of it. Just volunteers in the spring of the year. We'll start out reading this very, very familiar text. And I edited it. It would be longer than this in most translations of the Bible, but I edited it down a bit. You need a, there we go. So who wants to come in, Doug?
Yes.
Pull up. Who wants to start reading? Anybody? Jim, you want to start? You got your glasses?
I don't have my glasses.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who got glasses? Who can read? Anybody?
Spring of the year.
Okay. Susie? Oh, who's reading? Okay.
How far you want me to read?
The first paragraph there.
In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged the Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem.
Okay, let me stop there and put in a interesting little parenthesis here that is often found when we're reading the Samuel Kings, those very ancient books like that. It's an interesting little piece here. In the spring of the year, when kings go out to battle, Now, when my kids were coming along in the spring of the year, they played baseball, played softball, played baseball. Weather gets better, and you go outdoors to play. In farming life, you get the fields plowed, and you get maybe harvest. I mean, you get the planted and everything, and then you take a break and do whatever you want to. And what this says here is in the spring of the year, when everything else sort of quieted down, the kings went out to battle. Fun little piece there. When you look at a map of that part of the world, Canaan and all, when this story was set, when you look at that, there were all kinds of little kingdoms scattered all around. Dean read about the Moabites, the Jebusites, all these little kingdoms. They were hardly, they were tiny. They were much, we would think of them as a county, not a huge kingdom, but a county. Probably none of them would be as big as Hall County, and certainly not as well populated. At the most, they had 40 or 50,000 people in the kingdom. They were really kind of kinglets, little bitty kingdoms. When you read the Bible here, you run about king of this, king of that, king of this, king of that. But they really were little bitty kingdoms, and they were all jumbled up together. Now, today, when you look at a map, you have Israel up and down Israel. Uh, in the ancient days, along the coast, you had the Philistines. So here's Israel. There's a little bit of a map up there. You can maybe turn around and see it. But Israel is in the middle there. Along the coast were the Philistines. We call them the Phoenicians. Today it's Lebanon. A lot of those is Lebanon. But Israel today has everything from the Jordan River over to the Mediterranean Sea there. But in those days, they were little bitty kind of kingdoms. And every spring, those kings went to battle with each other. That's just what they did. Whether they had much to fight about or not, that's what they did. So in the spring of the year, the kings went out to battle. That's just what they did. Okay, then if you want to read on. Okay.
It happened late one afternoon that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, the Hittite." So David sent messengers to fetch her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. The woman conceived, and she sent David and said, "I am pregnant."
So here we go. This is the setup here. When I was a wee lad, a movie came out with Gregory Peck and Hedy Lamarr or one of these. This was in the 50s, late 50s. I remember that movie with Uriah the Hittite and all here. So he's on top of his roof there one day, looks across next door, and there was a beautiful woman out there bathing. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Outdoor bathing. Who wants to read again? You want to keep on reading? Okay. Who else has got glasses? John, you got glasses?
Yes.
Okay. So David.
So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite, and Jacob sent Uriah to David. When David came to him, David asked him how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David, Uriah did not come down to the house, David said to Uriah, you have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, as you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing. And David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. But he did not go down to the house.
Yes. Here is the setup. Bathsheba and David have had their affair, and now she is pregnant. And we read between the lines here, rather than David admitting his mistake, he and Joab, his general, his ruthless general, engaged in the cover-up. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's what they did. So then he sends for Uriah, and what he wants Uriah to do, Uriah's been out fighting. So David calls in Uriah and said, look, I know you're tired. You've been out fighting. I want you to have a rest. I want you to go home. I want you to go home and wash your feet. Now, you can translate wash your feet in several ways, but in Hebrew, it can also be more than washing your feet. I mean, that's just the way, that's the way us nice English people translate it. But wash your feet was spend the night with your wife, is really what he was telling Uriah to do. But Uriah does not do that. He spends the night in the palace. He does not go home. David wanted him to go home so he could put the word out that Uriah spent the night with his wife and she became pregnant. Here is the cover up. Here is the king's cover. So you want to read more, John? Next on the bottom. In the morning,
David wrote a letter to
Joab.
Sent Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then drove back from him, so that he may be struck down and die.
Go to page 2. Top of page 2.
Joab was besieging the city. He assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. The men of the city came out and fought with Uriah, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well.
Okay. So that's the basic story right here. David and Bathsheba. You're very familiar with that story. If you've been to church at all, you've heard sermons or studied that in Sunday school or something. And what I want to do from there, we look at the story more carefully in a little bit, but I want us to try to get down inside of that a little bit and maybe push ourselves just a little bit here. The first thing that I keep reminding myself of, and you too, and anybody that I talk with these days, keep in mind that people wrote the Bible. Whatever your view of inspiration might be, which is fine, that's your choice. There are all kind of levels of understanding of divine inspiration about the Bible. But be that as it may, people wrote the Bible. And more we're coming to understand, the scholars. Let me quickly say, I am not a scholar. I'm a very serious student. I do not read Hebrew. I do not read Greek. I don't read Coptic. I don't do any of that stuff. So I depend on secondary sources. But I love to do this, and it's been a great fun. So people wrote the Bible. And now we're understanding more and more that a group of men, maybe a few women, but a group of men emerged along the way. We'll talk about that in a minute, who were scribes. They were called scribes. In the New Testament, Jesus had to run ins with the scribes and the Pharisees. That's a long time down the line, different genre entirely. But these scribes were men who could read and write. And in this case, they were learning to read and write in the developing Hebrew language. We'll talk about that in a little bit further. Languages evolve. Alphabet, we'll see how important alphabets were along the way, but we'll look at that a bit more closely. These people used words that are at best approximation of reality. Betty has on what I would call a red shirt. She probably would call that a scarlet blouse or some other kind of fancier name. You got on what I would call blue, which you might call it teal. What I'm saying is we have words, we have language and language is always an approximation. I was up early this morning going to a group of kind of a group of men that meet on Thursday morning. And I was out early watching the daybreak come, watching sun come up. Well, I was saying the sun was coming up. Well, no, sun really wasn't coming up. That's our language for saying the morning was coming. What was really doing, I sat there also, well, there was not any breeze stirring. No, the trees were not moving at all. Then I had to remind myself that this earth is turning on an axis and all, and we are presently moving at something like 25,000 miles an hour. We're moving while we sit here 25,000 miles an hour. We have language to say that. I could say the sun was beautiful coming up this morning, and I'm using words. I'm using words to express what I was seeing. Every piece of literature all day long, we use words to approximate what we are seeing or what we are experiencing. Bill could teach us a whole lot about logic and language and all that kind of stuff. But words. So people wrote words in the Bible, and words are beautiful. That's all we've got. But words are always just approximate. I see my grandsons, and I adore my grandsons. I can say you're beautiful, you're handsome, you're smart enough, but still I don't quite get to the essence even of what I feel from my grandson. You see? So the Bible is a corpus, a body of words written by people who were trying their very best to understand God, to understand life, to understand everything that was real to them. So, okay, we're dealing with approximation. The other piece that I like to remember is these writers who wrote many, many thousands of years ago did not know they were writing scripture. They were writing. The New Testament is primarily a corpus of letters. We have four Gospels. We have Acts, which is history. With those five books were sort of history. The rest of the New Testament, the Christian Testament, is letters. And Paul and these other guys were writing to individuals. They had no idea that they were writing scripture, particularly the people who wrote what we call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. They were writing out of their heart. They were writing out of their sense of awe, but they didn't know they were writing scripture. Okay? Along the way, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years ago, women and men read what they wrote. And women and men decided that what Amos and Hosea and all these other characters had written were words from God. We wrote, we used words, and we collectively decided that this was the word of God. And that stuck with us all these many hundreds, thousands of years now. That, again, this is how it came about. And you decide for yourself about the inspiration or the gift of the words and all like that. But that's trying to get inside of it. And they wrote with an agenda. We always write with an agenda. And they wrote with an agenda to a community of people. You go to the New Testament, go to the Christian Testament, Paul's letter to the Galatians, to the churches of Galatia. Paul, a man, interesting, smart man, full of God, wrote in Greek to what he says the churches of Galatia. He had a group of people in mind to whom he wrote, and he had a particular message that he wanted to give to the people, to those churches, those church groups, what I'm calling clubs, in a section of the Roman Empire called Galatia. I'm quoting today, I'm lifting today from the book of Samuel, which is a very, very old book. The book of Samuel, we'll talk about that in a minute, has an agenda. They were not just out there, they wrote with an idea. Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, the great prophet, all had an idea of what they were writing, to whom they were writing it, and why. So, okay? Is that okay, everybody?
Yes, sir.
Huh? Got it? All right.
Well, I think I do.
Okay. Well, yeah, we can stop here. I get to talking. You interrupt, wave your hand. Hey, I don't know what that is all about. Let's back up and talk about that. So this is kind of the way that I'm understanding. And I say along the way, people like you and me, we have to constantly remind ourselves that people like you and me decided that these great words were nothing other than the word of God. I also like to say the Bible is, for me, is as much a word about God as it is a word from God. Because women and men, particularly men, were writing about their understanding of God in their lives, in their history, among their people. So they were writing out of their own experience, under the inspiration, however you want to understand it, of what they were doing. And always to understand that your faith and mine is larger than the Bible. As important as the Bible is, our faith is larger than the Bible. It's larger than the hymns we sing. It is larger than the doctrines. It is larger, all of that. Like to be an American, we have the Constitution, we have the Declaration of Independence, but who we are as Americans is always bigger than everything that we've written. So our faith is bigger than the Bible. The Bible is an incredibly important guide and aid and words and poetry and all to enrich our faith. But who you are and what you are is always bigger than any book that we have. So keep in mind too that when we're dealing with an ancient story like this, I always find it helpful for the 5 W's. Okay, the 5 W's: the who, where, when, what, and why. Who, where, what, when, and why. And we do that with everything that we write of any consequence. When Bill was teaching logic and Texas and using a textbook or maybe stuff that he wrote, he was always saying, what's this about? Who wrote it? What's the purpose of this? Why was it written? So I say here, the 5 W's of the story of David and Bathsheba: the who, why, where, when, that. What is this story all about? Other than the fact it is a charming, rather scandalous story here, what are the 5 W's? But so as we move into the story, I'm going to try to get down inside of the story, and I'm not going to just go through the 5 W's. I will come out at the end of our time here with the why. What was this thing all about? Okay. And I'm talking now out of the prevailing scholarship of this kind of study. I need to quickly say that there is no unanimous agreement about the Bible or any part of it. You hear me talking, somebody else would come along taking the same idea and they would come at it with a different slant. Take the very same stuff, have a different slant. So you're hearing my slant. It may not be your slant, but this is my slant. After I was talking with somebody in our Sunday school class, I go to a group at First Baptist, and somebody was commenting And I said, the joy of my life is for the last 60 or 70 years, somebody has paid me to do all of this reading and study. I'm very, very grateful that enough people, enough church groups, and all along the way gave me a living so that I could do what I really do like to do, which is try to get inside of the Bible and theology and all like that. So this is the different slants on this. So to get inside now just a little bit, y'all with me? Okay, we will sort of together. The episode, the story that Dean and John read, the story would be set in about 1000 BCE, before the Common Era. Remember, we're not saying BC and AD, we're saying BCE and CE. Before the Common Era and the Common Era. We're in the Common Era now. We're in CE. A lot of reasons for that. So the story of David and Bathsheba is set. The milieu of that story would be about 1000 BCE, which is a very, very long time ago. Okay, the story is set there. Story, but it was not written until much later. Story is set. Whatever happened with David and Bathsheba happened, say, 1000 BCE. Part of the reason it was not written until later was that the Hebrew language was still in the early stages of development. We were in high school and all, we studied Egyptian hieroglyphics. We also studied the Mycenaean wedge shape, cuneiform, They didn't have alphabet. They didn't have alphabets like they didn't have ABC or Alpha Beta Gamma. They had pictures. Along the way, the story is pretty fascinating. People on that coast there, the Phoenicians, the Philistines, the Phoenicians, by most investigations, were among the first, if not the first, people to begin to use an alphabet. An alphabet is simply the ability to take a sound and find a symbol to signify the sound. So we have apple. Now the ancient Egyptians would have had all kind of little pictures to describe apple. The Mycenaeans and others would have had all kind of little wedges to describe apple. But along the way, the Phoenicians and then the Greeks and then the Hebrews came up with a symbol for They always said apple, whatever the language was. You vocalize the language. But how do you write it? That's the key to it. And along the way, our ancient ancestors began to develop the alphabet. A, B, C, D, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Alpha, Beta, the Greeks and all like that. The idea is that a sound can be reduced to a symbol. We have 26 letters. Typical Hebrew has 22 symbols. Hebrew in its present iteration for the last long time, does not have vowels. The vowel sound A, E, I, O, and U are not written in Hebrew. They come to be added. That's another whole story. So they have 22 symbols. And that took a long time to develop. So they were in the time of David and after, the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet was forming. But David probably could not read and write because there was nothing to read and write. He didn't read hieroglyphics. He's not Egyptian. The Sumerians were long gone. So there's nothing to read and write. He could sing and he could memorize and and the great writings were developing, but he probably could not read and write because there was nothing to read or write in a way that he could manage. If he were Egyptian, he probably could read hieroglyphic, but in Canaan where he lived, the language was not developed. It wasn't developing. So the stories that we have in First, Second Kings, First, Second Samuel were verbal. They were told from generation to generation. You go to the family reunion every 4 or 5 years, and Grandpa tells his story. If you listen to Grandpa long enough, those stories get better and better. They get richer and richer, not just 10, but 20, that he does. So that was a lot of these stories go all the way back, well before they were written. So the stories were told. Two major events happened that we've talked about before. The little bitty kingdom of Israel and the little bitty kingdom of Judah both were wiped out by imperial armies in 722 and 586 BC. And we know now, pretty well established, that after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, that many thousands of people of Judah were carried off into captivity over into, in this case, into Babylon, which would be in the modern day Iraq. They were deported by the thousands to that part of the world over there. And that's when the Bible, as we have it in any measure, really began to develop. They took the stories, they took the ideas, they took their histories as they had begun to tell them, and then by then they began to write down and put them in form, much that we have today. So the Babylonian captivity, as disastrous as it was to the ancient Jews, really can't call them Jews yet, call them Israelites, was very important in the life of these ancient people, because these scribes, over a period of decades, they didn't just organize. I mean, this what Dr. Wright says. It happened. They began to write and to tell this story. We'll talk about that in a minute. So David and Bathsheba, whatever that was, okay, that was 1000 BCE. The story that Dean and John read probably was written in about 500 BCE, 500 years after whatever happened to David and Bathsheba. Okay, I mean yeah, they didn't. That's just the way. That's what happened. In one iteration or the other, that's what happened. If you want to get a lesson from that, is out of defeat comes victory. Out of the defeat of the Israelites in North and South came what we have today as the Bible. The Bible for us, and in its many forms, is a gift out of that defeat. Okay. Talk about biblical archaeology. I studied that kind of stuff in college and seminary, but I didn't pay much attention to it. In my Old Testament course at the seminary, the professor was Dr. Ralph Smith. He would take us to the studio like we have in here and start showing slides. He put the lights out and show us slides of all of this stuff that he was talking about. And frankly, that was an hour for a nap for me. Turn the lights out, big comfortable chairs. Slept through all of it. We had to sign that we had read all this stuff. And the joke of my colleague was, before we get into heaven, we've got to sit outside and do all that reading that we wrote, that we had written. We're gonna get our payback when that time comes, because we didn't do it. I did okay in this course, but biblical archaeology. I began to think, reading a lot, we think, well, the story that we read in the Bible was set in Jerusalem. This is what it said. David stayed in Jerusalem. And until recently, I thought, sure, okay, that's okay. And then I began to read more archaeology, and the archaeologists would say, no, Saul was a real king. Saul had a birthday, but Saul was king over one of these little bitty pieces, just a few tribes, probably. David then comes along, a lot we know about David. Uh, and David, through hit and miss, created the little kingdom of Judah. Uh, but Jerusalem, the archaeology is prevailing strong that David ruled not from Jerusalem because it was not very well formed yet, but in the ancient city of Hebron. If you remember the biblical story, when the people decided David was going to be the king, Saul was dead, they took him to Hebron to anoint him. He wasn't crowned, he was anointed. And the archaeologists are saying that David ruled not from Jerusalem, but from Hebron. Why? In those days, well, one thing, the site of Jerusalem, Jebus, has been inhabited for tens of thousands of years. It is a fortuitous hill that was easily protected. And so the site of Jerusalem, where it is today, has been lived in for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But in biblical archaeology is determined to find what happened and not to shore up various stories. We used to read archaeology as trying to prove the story, the biblical story. We know now that archaeology, these are scientists, and they go out and try to understand what was really happening 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, and let the chips fall where they may. And the chips of this story of Jerusalem falls that Jerusalem was not David's capital, that Hebron was David's capital. Now, so what? That's just whatever you want to do with it. If you're ever on Jeopardy, you might know that and win a lot of money or something. But the story, probably the fact is that David did not rule from Jerusalem; he ruled from Hebron. And then the way the biblical story unfolds is that David ruled, Solomon came along, Solomon's son Rehoboam came along. David had created a unified kingdom. This is what I was taught when I was in school. David created a unified kingdom. And then when Rehoboam came along, he blew it and the kingdom split apart. Archaeology is pretty unanimous in saying that there was never a unified kingdom, that David ruled Judah, which was substantial then. Probably 50 or 60,000 people lived in David's time in the kingdom of Judah, which was a lot of people in those days. The kingdom of Israel up north was bigger and stronger. David's kingdom lasted from about 1000 BCE till it was destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians. The Israelite kingdom came into existence about this same time, but they ended in 722 BCE when the Assyrians came along and destroyed it. So anyway, which is to say, I begin to say, okay, what about Solomon's temple? And again, archaeology calls that into question. Archaeologists would say that maybe Solomon built a temple in Hebron, but not anywhere on the scope and scale that we understand that later existed. A temple came along that was magnificent, but it was built a couple of hundred years into the kingdom. And it was that beautiful temple that the Babylonians destroyed in 586. But it was not Solomon's temple. And so that's why they often talk about the first temple and the second temple. Again, that's just something that's just interesting. But archaeology is important. And and what they do is they come up with all kinds of ideas, scientific stuff, pottery and skeletons and stuff like that to try to establish what really happened. Then you decide what you want. You decide what you want to do with it, but that's probably.
So during this period, were they speaking Hebrew primarily, or?
They spoke. No, they were not speaking Hebrew yet. You're asking me stuff that I don't know. They spoke a Canaanite language. They spoke a Canaanite dialect. Hebrew was not Hebrew was happening, but David probably spoke some kind of Canaanite derivative of language. And I don't know what that is. We do know that from the time of the Babylonian captivity under Persia, back up. The Babylonians captured Jerusalem, and then about 70 or 80 years later, the Persians came along and beat the Babylonians, and the Persians, over time, spoke what they called an Aramaic dialect, Aramaic. And it's very pretty well often determined that Jesus, in Jesus' time, 400-500 years after all this, spoke Aramaic. He spoke in an Aramaic, which was a Persian derivative. But by Jesus' time, Greek was the lingua franca. Anybody that was educated knew Greek. And my theory there is that Jesus was bilingual. Every day he talked Aramaic, but he lived near a large city called Sepphoris, which would have driven the economy of that region. And it was a Greek city. So Jesus and his people for hundreds and hundreds of years could do both. It's like our Hispanic friends here. They speak English, but when they're off by themselves, they speak Hispanic. They speak a derivative of Spanish in some way or the other. So the lingua franca is English, but when they're home by themselves, probably most of them comfortably speak Spanish. So Jesus knew two languages. He could get along. He could get along. He spoke Aramaic, but he could speak. He could read and I think read and write Greek. All the New Testament, of course, is written in Greek. Hebrew, the Bible is written in various iterations of Hebrew. Okay. So the story itself, whether it happened exactly like what we have handed down to us, it's a fascinating story. It has shaped thinking for 2,500 years now. The story of David and Bathsheba is a classic story. And the people who understand this kind of stuff say it is exquisitely written. It is just a masterpiece of short story. The whole story of David is that kind of thing. It's a fascinating story. What kind of person was David? We can mythologize David. When I was a young boy, my grandmother read Bible stories to me out of I remember it very vividly, a little orange Bible story book. And my grandmother was a very difficult lady, but she loved to read. And I would sit still. My other brothers would not, but I would sit still long enough for her to read to me. And of course, out of that is the story of David and Goliath. I love that story. It's interesting when you read all of that. There are two narratives in the Bible about David. One is the boy, the 12-year-old boy, goes out with Goliath with his slingshot, And the other is David, the young warrior, who also goes out with a slingshot. You got two different stories in there. At any rate, David kills Goliath in the way the story is told there. Who was David then? I imagine David an absolutely charming, charismatic, smart, gifted, probably largely immoral, determined to get what he wanted, uh, and yet you would have loved him. He would have been the kind of young man, the man that you love. You loved him in spite of all of his foibles. He was a charming, kind of charismatic individual. Uh, and the story here of David and Bathsheba is an insight into David's character, whatever else it is. The Bible, by putting it all together, David had 8 wives and concubines, 8 wives and concubines, and he had 19 identifiable children. This is the Bible, 8 wives and concubines and 19 children. Imagine Christmas morning, 8 wives and 19 children. What kind of, they didn't do it, of course. The point I'm making there is, it's not like David didn't have anybody to satisfy his desires for. He saw, whatever, he saw this beautiful woman over there and he wanted her, regardless of, didn't bother him that she was married, and I also say that it's not the most flattering picture of Bathsheba. The king wanted her. The king wants me. What about Uriah? Well, we'll figure that one out later. So Bathsheba, under the law, could have refused to go to David. And she probably would have gotten in a lot of trouble. He wouldn't have liked that. But Bathsheba, I don't see her as some kind of, David did not rape Bathsheba. Bathsheba participated in that. But here is a sign of a symbol of David's arrogance. It's also a sign of the way the ruler was completely authoritative. He could do what he wanted. And then the story takes its really double ugly turn when David, rather than fess up, yep, I did it, take his lumps. I have said many times, when I opened the paper, the Washington Post that morning, and it said that Bill Clinton had had an affair with Monica Lewinsky, I said to myself, he did it. That was a year before it all came out. Bill Clinton dragged the country a whole year through all of that stuff. He was impeached and on and on. And finally, he had to say, I had an inappropriate sexual relationship with that young woman. Can't you imagine what Hillary had already done to him? Can't imagine what that would have been. But if Clinton had initially said, yeah, I did that, we would have fussed and groaned and complained, but we would have gone on. Other presidents had had affairs. We know that. Roosevelt, Kennedy, Garfield, on and on. They all had affairs. But he didn't. So, and then Nixon, if Nixon had said, that was stupid break in, I'm sorry, he would have finished his term. He would have been at least an outstanding foreign affairs president. We might not have had the horrors of Vietnam and all if he had admitted it, but it cost him his kingdom, cost him his presidency. If David had, that's the saying, if David had said, I did it, I'm sorry, I will adopt this baby, pardon me, Uriah. But what did David decide he would get rid of Uriah? Uriah, I'm saying, was a Green Beret guy. Uriah was special forces. Uriah the Hittite connotes that he was an outstanding soldier, devoted to David, devoted to whatever the king wanted. And David just got rid of him. David told Joab. Joab is a major secondary player in the story of David. Joab loved David. no doubt. Joab loved David, and Joab would do anything that David wanted, and or Joab would do anything that he felt like would strengthen David's position as king. So when David sent word to Joab, get rid of Uriah, the next day they put Uriah in the front of the battle where he was sure to be killed. So that's the basic story there. And then, can't you imagine how David felt when Nathan the prophet, Nathan the preacher, came along with his bony finger, told a story, uh, a parable about a man stealing sheep and all like this, a fascinating story. And Nathan says, "What would you do with a man like that?" And David said, "I would kill him." And then Nathan pointed his finger and said, "Thou art the man, thou art the man." So Nathan cut through all the debris there, all of the trash, and David was indicted. And he was, and then the scripture says he was truly sorry. He was very pained at what had happened there. And then the great Psalm 51 is attributed to David, the great penitential psalm there from David. So the story about David and Bathsheba, hard to get down inside of. Fascinating story. When I begin to poke around in that and begin to ask the second and third kind of questions there, I get to a better understanding of the Bible for myself. And I get to a much clearer, I think, understanding of who these people were and how human they were. We've often said the Bible is very brutally honest. Other national histories cover up the sins of the king, cover up the sins of the leader. But the Bible does not do that. The Bible does not do that. David was that Saul, and on and on and on. The Bible quickly tells the foibles of the great ones in there. Why was it written then? Quickly, why was this story written? I think it was written in the time in which it came out. Back up. When the Jews were defeated, they were devastated. Those imperial armies had pretty well wiped them out. They were devastated. Typically, when a group of people like that was defeated, they disappeared. All the way through, they disappeared. But along the way, these scribes who gave us much of what we have in the Bible determined that their people would not disappear. But they would never have a king again, and they would never be a kingdom again. They were little tiny country, 290 kingdoms. The imperial army go back and forth, eventually Rome and all the rest of them. So these scribes decided that they would help these people become a nation, become a people. And this is what our founding fathers did. They decided that the United States would not be a kingdom, we would be a nation. And our founding documents, particularly the Declaration of Independence, is designed for us to be a nation and not a kingdom. No, we were not going to have any kings in America. So it's a very human story. It's a great story. I love to poke around in it and see what new stuff we might turn up with it. For me, it gives me a better understanding of what the Bible really is all about. The Bible then becomes a window and a gate to faith and not a prison. And a lot of the trouble we've gotten into across the centuries is when we make the Bible a prison rather than windows and doors. One of the great scientists of the 16th century was a guy named Bruno. He was a scientist, and he was among the early ones who said that the earth went around the sun rather than the sun going up, that that the sun went around the earth rather than the earth going around the sun. In other words, it's going to be a heliocentric universe rather than an earth-centered universe. The Catholic Church said, no, that's not the way that it happened. There's a story in Joshua when Joshua was fighting a battle, and the Bible says Joshua prayed to God that God would stop the sun so Joshua could have enough daylight to win the battle, and the sun stopped. And Galileo and these other guys said, no, that's not the way. Bruno would not relent. Galileo finally caved in just before he died. Bruno would not cave in, and they burned him at the stake because of that rigid understanding of the Bible that was prevalent at the time. The Bible is a gate and a window into faith or faithing, and not a prison. So what I'm after is to try to find the liberation of the Bible. Okay. How about that? Okay.
That's right. It's been a while, darling.
Next time, you can wait until next time, next Thursday. We're going to do some of the characters in the Bible. We're going to talk about the serpent. We're going to talk about Satan. We're going to talk about the fallen angels. The Bible did different, and we're going to talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, these strange creatures in the Bible. So you can wait with bated breath until next Thursday. So, okay, thank you. Thanks, JW, for doing the techniques for us up there. Okay, take it with if you want to. Y'all are fun to work with. I'm glad to try to do this with you.
Thank you. That's into that. I appreciate your you doing that. And
It's fun, it's fun.
Share. I want to think.
Thanks, Bob, from Washington.
Well, that's old friend Pete David. Yay, Pete. Hey, Pete is one of my friends and scholars from Maryland. Great friend. We've done many national baseball games together. Pete is the best lay theologian.
But Bob, don't be watching the Nats lately. They're getting crushed.
Do what?
I said,
Thank you.
don't be watching Nationals baseball lately.
Oh,
they're getting
yeah.
crushed.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.